Professor Mohammad Marandi, thanks so much for coming here and being here in the flesh. I want to ask you, how has this, I don't want to call it a drama, tragedy, been seen from Iran?
Well, I think in Iran it was something that was not surprising. I mean, when the Saudis have been allowed to behave with impunity for decades, and the United States, along with the Saudis, helped create extremist groups in Afghanistan during the 1980s to combat the Soviet Union and thus destroying much of Afghanistan alongside the Soviet Union. But still, we have the destruction of their culture. Pakistan has been changed. The extremism that persists today is largely as a result of U.S.-Saudi behavior. And even after 9/11, there was a brief period where there were serious questions raised in the United States about this alliance, but after a while that dissipated, and again, the Saudis were allowed to do basically anything they wanted. When a country or when a regime like the Saudi regime is allowed to starve the whole of Yemen with Western support, with their advisors on the ground, with their weapons being used persistently, then I don't think it's really all that strange for the decorum of political institutions like consulates and embassies to be violated by the Saudis.
Strong words there, strong words. Hold those words and that thought. I'll be back to you very soon. But I want to go now to Washington and bring in a friend of Jamal Khashoggi, Khaled Saffuri, who is live for us there in Washington. Thanks so much for speaking to us today. And you are outside, I believe, the Washington Post offices.
Thank you.
I want to ask you, tell us one of your favorite anecdotes about your time and your friendship with Jamal.
Well, Jamal was always concerned about the future of the Arab and Muslim world and if it ever become democratic. So I think he was very sensitive to this issue and he always bring it up. It was his daily worry about how things were turning in the opposite direction. So I think he devoted his life to this issue, especially towards the end, and he thought that people deserve better. He said, we always said we deserve better than this. So I think this was, everyone that knew Jamal, they knew that he cared a lot about other people and about their fate, about the future of the region.
And what among his work stood out for you?
I'm sorry?
What among his work,
what
among his work, his articles stood out for you?
Well, I think all his articles reflected these views. He always, he commended the Saudi government when he thought they were doing positive reforms. But towards the end, he became more and more critical because he thought, you don't do reforms, then you jail people calling for reforms. That there are lots of corrupt people that should have been in jail and they're out free, moving freely, while the people that were calling for peaceful improvement of people's life in their daily life or calling for freedom, for women's right to drive, were put in jail. So he thought towards the end that the things were going in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. So, but he always expressed that he's not an opposition, he's a reformer. He wished the best for his country, he wished the best for Saudi Arabia.
And Khaled, a question that I've also asked my guests here is, do you think Mohammed bin Salman or Saudi Arabia, whoever, has got away with it?
Well, I think whoever committed this crime didn't think the reaction will be this big. They probably thought people will be talking about Jamal for a few days, then it will end. People think he disappeared. You just never know, like many people disappeared and no one carry on their cause. So I think whoever did it is surprised, but I think also they're helped by the lack of cooperation from the Trump administration. I think the administration is complicit and they don't want to reach the bottom of it. But what's good about democracy in the West, that presidents don't stay for life. They have terms that they have to serve. And I think the future of the killers is in the hand. If Trump doesn't stay in power, he loses elections in 1 year. I think the intelligence community have information that's being suppressed by the current White House. That information will be out in public, and I think the real perpetrators will eventually be caught. It might be a year or 2 or 3 late, but eventually I think they're not going to get away with it.
And that's interesting you talk about the intelligence, because we know the CIA has concluded with medium to high confidence that Mohammed bin Salman targeted Khashoggi and probably ordered his death. But tell me, you're there in the US. Why isn't there more pressure now? I mean, you say it may come out within a year, but why isn't there more pressure now?
Well, the White House have the last call, and the White House is forcing the intelligence community to keep this stuff hush-hush. Of course, Congress have the power of subpoenaing, and that's what they did with Gina Haspel. Briefed Congress about the intelligence information last year, I believe in March or April. It was clear that they had evidence tying him up. I've been told that there were 7 interrupted calls were made from the Saudi consulate in Istanbul to Riyadh with 2 very close confidants and aides to the Crown Prince were relaying messages back and forth to the team that committed the crime. And I think this evidence will probably end up coming to the come to the public probably in a year or 2 after Trump leaves the White House. And I think things will change. So a lot is hanging on the future of this administration.
Very interesting, because that is what also Iyad al-Baghdadi said. He said that Mohammed bin Salman only got away with it because Trump is in the White House. Just quoting him there. All right, Khaled, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on the News Hour. Khaled Saffuri, thank you very much. All right, I'm joined still here by my guests. I want to go back to you, Professor Mohammad Marandi, finally here in Istanbul with us. There is something, again, just that Iyad pointed out. What do we do next? We shouldn't spend so much time talking about facts, although for many of us these are still questions. You're also a political analyst. What do you think should happen next?
Well, I don't think much more is going to happen. The Turkish government was very wise in the way in which they disseminated information during the first few months, keeping the whole issue on in the news. The only thing they have left are the recordings. They could use that on occasions in future to bring this to the forefront again of the news. But I don't think we're going to get much further. I do agree that Mohammed bin Salman is very much dependent on Trump, although perhaps I'm cynical, but I think the only reason why he is being, this case is being pursued by Trump's opponents, it has more to do with them opposing Trump than they actually have, than it actually has to do with being opposed to Mohammed bin Salman. The animosity between the opponents of Trump and supporters of Trump in the United States, it's so deep now that anything that is linked to Trump will automatically be opposed by the other side. So I don't think it's simply because they support human rights or they feel sorry for Jamal's fate. I would say this, though, and I think is very important to keep in mind, that Saudi Arabia is going downhill. Mohammed bin Salman is not someone who learns from his mistakes or crimes. We saw the foolishness of him when he, immediately after inviting billionaire investors to Saudi Arabia at the Ritz, then he goes and turns it into a prison. That imagery doesn't bring in investors. Then we saw the kidnapping of the Lebanese prime minister and his beating.
But surely deals are still being done. You say Saudi Arabia is going downhill, but surely deals that we don't know about are still being done.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that he does not learn. If he was, I mean, he was born a billionaire. The older generation of the Saud family, they were tough people. They may not have been the greatest people, but they struggled to power. This is a person who was born with yes men surrounding him. And we see from what he did to the Prime Minister of Lebanon, what he did in Yemen, what he did to Qatar, what he did in Turkey, and so on, that he simply is not learning. There's no learning process here where he moderates his behavior. And the war in Yemen is draining the country. The United States in Iraq, what helped push forward the economic crisis in 2007 and 8 was the enormous expenditure that the United States had in Iraq. Okay. The Saudis cannot continue this war in Yemen and all these antagonisms and just move forward without any problems.
And let me ask Azzam about this. How has this murder, killing, or butchering, as that's the word that you've used, impacted the Arab world and Saudi Arabia's image within the Arab world?
I think it has contributed to exposing this monarchy for what it is within Saudi Arabia as well as in the neighborhood. People no longer have that regard for the country or for the leadership of that country. And I think the murder of Jamal Khashoggi is not isolated from the revival of the Arab Spring that we see at the moment in the region. Algeria, Sudan, now Egypt, probably elsewhere. Because Saudi Arabia, together with the United Arab Emirates, were the main funders of the counter-revolution that frustrated Arab hopes in a better future. And people now link Jamal's murder to such an effort made by the government of Saudi Arabia.
All right. I want to now look a bit more in depth at some of the evidence that we do have in the investigation by Agnes Kalamard and our correspondent Francis Collins. He actually spoke with the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions. That's her title, Agnes Kalamard. And she compiled a report on Jamal Khashoggi's killing. Now, during the interview, Kalamard rejected the Saudi claim that her report was biased. Take a listen.
When my report was presented to the Human Rights Council in June, the authorities in Saudi Arabia responded very negatively and very critically. They rejected the report, they rejected my conclusions, and the basis for their rejection remained very general and broad. They argued that my sources were compromised and that I relied exclusively or far too much on the media to back up my position. I had little opportunities to engage with them directly, in fact, no opportunity at all. However, as I have made it clear in the public, to the public, and as my report highlights with great pain, I did not rely on the media as a source of information. Not that the media is incorrect, but given the standard of evidence I was using, I could not have relied on the media sources for a finding or a conclusion. I ensured that the evidence I had provided was triangulated, meaning that several sources were able to back it up, coming from different perspectives. And I used, as I mentioned, a standard of evidence that has been tested by the UN and Commission of Inquiries for many years now. I have to say that the Saudi government has never been able to point to one aspect of my report that they reject specifically. They have only rejected it generally, and they have more largely rejected any attempt of international scrutiny over what they have described as a domestic matter, even though there is nothing domestic in the killing of Mr. Khashoggi.
All right, I want to go back to our studio guests here, and we were listening there to Agnes Kalamard, and it's very interesting because she has been critical of the UN, and she said, I've discovered, as I conducted my investigations into Khashoggi, that the UN has no meaningful role to play or had failed to act in a meaningful fashion. How disappointed are you at hearing this? This question to you, Ms. Mohammad Marandi.
I'm not surprised. I've never had any great faith in the UN. Again, when we go back and look at the war in Yemen, the United States, the United Nations, what's interesting, they interexchanged the words, but they blacklisted Saudi Arabia for 3 days, and then they removed Saudi Arabia from the blacklist in 72 hours. And that shows the impact of the United States, the Europeans, and of course Saudi and Emirati money on this body. So it's something that is expected, just like when we look at Palestine or Gaza and the regular killings,
okay.
we don't see any reaction from the UN.
Azzam, are you surprised by the UN and Agnes Calamar's results?
Well, the UN was constructed in a manner that only the 5 permanent members of the Security Council can decide what it can do or what it cannot do. So long as the United States of America and in the opposite direction, Russia, have a veto right, nothing really comes out of the United Nations. Therefore, yes, I'm not surprised.
You're not surprised. And just very quickly, we've got 30 seconds before we have to go. Do you think next year, on October the 2nd, we will be asking the same questions? Azzam?
I really don't know, but we have to keep up the pressure. We mustn't give up, and we must keep this issue alive,
All right.
no matter what.
And we'll keep it there. And very quickly, Mohammed.
The world is changing much faster than before. It's very difficult to keep up with the news. I would never predict the future.
All right, we'll leave it there. And thank you to my guests and for you at home watching us on the special broadcast with a look back now at the life of Jamal Khashoggi. Do stay with us here on TRT World, and thank you for your company as ever. Bye-bye.